Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Susan Gent. I'm a community engagement specialist at the Ames and Iowa State Public Libraries, and very excited this evening to have everyone here. I'm going to, and I feel very fortunate we have a person specially here to introduce Dr. Bix, Aja Lyons, who's a graduate student in the MFA Creative and Writing program at Iowa State University, and she will introduce Dr. Bix. And at the end of the talk, we'll come back and take some questions. So I'll see you at the end. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. We humble Iowans are immensely privileged to have one of the greatest STEM historians and rich minds in our community. Though she resides in Missouri and is a Chicago native, Dr. Amy Bix is a proud descendant of immigrants from the Ukraine. The Ames community stands in solidarity with her family and a mighty nation. Dr. Bix earned a Bachelor of Arts in Biology from Princeton University. As a result of her research and publications, she was elected to the Sigma Xi Scientific Research Honor Society. She then earned a PhD in History of Science from Johns Hopkins University. Her dissertation, Inventing Ourselves Out of Jobs, America's Depression-era debate over technological unemployment, was selected as one of the American Library Association's Choice Magazine Outstanding Academic Titles. In 2017, she was one of 3 historians to present at C-SPAN's National History Center Congressional Briefing on Automation and the Workforce to discuss the pros and cons of technological developments in the workplace and the increasingly rapid change of the digital age. Her most recently published book, Girls Coming to Tech, A History of American Engineering Education for Women, won the 2015 Margaret Rossiter Prize from the History of Science Society, the 2015 Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers USA Award for Distinguished Literary Contributions, and the 2014 Betty Vedder Award for Research from the Women in Engineering Proactive Network. Her scholarship connects the history of technology, science, and medicine with studies of women and gender, the history of education, and 20th century social, cultural, and intellectual history. In addition to teaching history, she's the director of the Center for Historical Studies of Technology and Science. Her service to educational enrichment has included consulting on science and engineering children's books for Redline Editorial, and on the advisory committee for an invention and innovation exhibit at the African American Museum of Iowa. Most exemplary of all is her servitude to students at Iowa State. The role of a historian is that of an analyst, dissecting information, and that of a storyteller. Though she's achieved the upper echelon as a professional academic historian, Dr. Bix adheres to the oldest and most honored role of her profession, that of the storyteller. Her narrative prowess is unmatched. When I took History of American Women with Dr. Bix in the fall of 2014, I was only a year into recovery from a traumatic brain injury from being victim to a drunk driver. But I can still recount learning about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York. Impoverished, exploited European immigrant women and girls were locked in on account of managerial practices to prevent theft and job abandonment when the building caught fire. The sole fire escape collapsed, and most workers died in the fire or from jumping from the windows. The union and safety laws implemented as a result of the ghastly loss of life were the foundation for current OSHA laws. Fall of 2021, I took History of Medicine with Dr. Bix 1 year after experiencing a severe psychological trauma. I can recount a timeline of medical practices and beliefs from Hippocrates, Galen and the Four Humors, to mysticism and homeopathic medicine. Pogroms unleashed under delusion of ridding plague. The revolution of hospital medicine. Implementation of quantification. Technological advancements in tools such as the microscope, stethoscope, and X-ray that proved former theories to confirm material reality previously unseen with the human eye alone. To complex socio-political systems that perpetuate medical sexism, racism, and classism in our current healthcare system. I couldn't tell you what I had for breakfast this morning, but I will always remember her vibrant storytelling. Dr. Bix has long reached out a hand to uplift young women and girls to stand strong and wield our power with both hands. She traces our past and empowers us to direct our own futures. We welcome your gift of knowledge, Dr. Bix.
Wow, thank you very much for that introduction. I hope I can live up to it. And I'll say I'd be a happy professor if I had all students as fabulously motivated and as enthusiastic as you are. And I'm only sorry that you've taken a lot of classes with me now, so we're running out of more classes for you to take, although you mentioned you'll be in mine in fall, which will be great. So, okay, so on to today's talk. Let me figure out how to share the screen here. Give me, and yes, I'm hoping everyone can see that. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. Okay, well, thank you all very much for being here. I really appreciate it at what's a busy time of the spring for everybody, I know. So what I'm talking about tonight is the research project that I've been involved with now for a few years that builds on my earlier research on the history of women in engineering. So the subject I want to talk about tonight is how Google, Microsoft, and Amazon all got into the girls' STEM business, movements to open science and engineering to young women. So one quote that I really love from the presidency of Barack Obama is, some of you may remember that when he was president, the White House held a large science fair every year. And a number of years he made diversity an explicit theme of that. And so in 2017, he said, "We get the most out of all our nation's talent, reaching out to boys and girls of all races and all backgrounds. Science is for all of us, and we want our classrooms, labs, workplaces, and media to reflect that." The amazing thing about this quote is just how standard it appears to us today. It doesn't seem to a lot of us that President Obama was saying anything radical here. But as a historian, you look at this and you know the history, and you realize that getting to the point where the president would be using the White House platform to speak about opening science to everyone, that really is amazing when you think about the history of gender and science and engineering. So really what I'm looking at is the history of how we got here. So this is the history of what I call the girls' STEM movement, the movement to engage more young women going into science and engineering and related fields. And the big picture of what I'm looking at is the story over about 6 decades, how several catalysts drove the emergence of this movement to get more young women into STEM. The first change is the big picture historical context, political and social changes in women's lives and gendered relationships, which inevitably includes the rise of the modern feminist movement. A second thing that happened that permanently changed the relationship between gender and STEM happened within science and engineering communities themselves, as leaders and practitioners began rethinking and explicitly redefining what it meant to do science and engineering in ways to make those fields potentially more inclusive. And the third big factor in change that really helped with the emergence of the girls' STEM movement is the rise of national institutional initiatives and, most recently, corporate funding connections to raise the profile, not just nationally, but internationally. So I don't have time to talk about a lot of this in complete depth. What I'm going to try to do is give you a broad overview, and then if you have questions, we can talk about specific elements more in the question period at the end. So again, the big picture where we started from is that in the late 19th century in the United States, science remained very much under the assumption that it was a field by and for men. The growth of women's colleges and land-grant schools, including Iowa State College in the second half of the 1800s, did open up classes in physics, botany, chemistry, and domestic science to thousands of women across the country. But one of the challenges they faced is when they got out of college with a science degree, what could they do with that? many graduates found themselves limited to what historian Margaret Rossiter has called women's work in science, low pay, low status jobs as assistant curators in museums, assistants in universities, and there's a very interesting history of women as computers. The picture here on the bottom right is women at the Harvard Observatory doing the boring but essential work of data crunching, working with numbers, working with photographs. They had to be absolutely precise. It was repetitious but essential work, but their names were never the ones at the top of the research papers, never the ones heading the laboratory. They did not have much chance for promotion or recognition. However, the picture becomes even more sharply skewed once you look at the history of engineering, because for decades, even more than in science, American engineering culture was defined by and for men. It's no coincidence that one of the first places to teach engineering in the United States was West Point, because of the long connection between engineering and the military. And as you can imagine, back then, there was really no thought of letting women into the military, letting women into West Point. Similarly, a lot of engineering culture in the early 1800s was defined by field work. Men who went out and built the Erie Canal, built the Transcontinental Railroad. Obviously, that wasn't a context that welcomed women. The same thing with connections between engineering and industry. Engineering in machine shops at the Pennsylvania Railroad, at US Steel. Again, that was pretty much an all-male atmosphere. So there was really no sense that women even could belong in engineering. One of the things that helps change this is the development of land-grant schools, such as Iowa State. In the early 1900s, a few dozen women in the US began earning engineering degrees one at a time from land-grant schools. And it's no coincidence Iowa State actually graduated a couple of the very first women to earn engineering degrees in this country. But again, they were really seen as unusual. You can see this article here on the left from the early 1900s. 3 co-eds invade engineering courses and compete with men at Cornell. I like the subhead, stand well in their studies. That word invade is really striking. You see that over and over again in reference to the appearance of just a few women, one at a time, really underlining the extent to which engineering was still seen as a masculine domain. And with this, it literally became headline news on the occasions when women chose to, quote, invade engineering. You can see here on the right, it became a front page news story that a total of 5 women had enrolled in Iowa State's engineering division in the early 20th century. So these women were really seen as oddities, as invaders. And it was really a double bind. Because they were studying engineering, they were not seen as, quote, normal women, but because they were women, they were not seen as being normal engineers. So very much curiosities. The thing that really started to change this was World War II. Most people are familiar with Rosie the Riveter, the history of how corporations became so desperate to keep up manufacturing 24/7 in wartime, turning out planes, tanks, and weaponry, even as men were being drafted and leaving, so desperate that they recruited women to work on the assembly line. But what a lot of people don't realize is that corporations were just as desperate during World War II to get help for the manpower shortages in their engineering shops. So even though they never would have done it during normal peacetime, companies suddenly started looking around in World War II and saying, we want to hire women engineers. But the problem is, again, just a handful had graduated before World War II. So the American government, universities, and private companies started an amazing series of programs during World War II to give women crash courses in engineering to help them understand the technical basics so they could quickly go into wartime industry and help win the war. One of the best examples of this is what's called the Curtiss-Wright Cadette program. Curtiss-Wright was a major manufacturer of airplanes during World War II. They hoped that they could train women to come speed up their production and development. But again, they just couldn't find enough women who already had engineering degrees in hand. So the Curtiss-Wright Company went to 7 colleges and said, will you help us? Will you give a speeded up course in aeronautical engineering to 100 women each? And one of those colleges that said, yes, we'll train Curtiss-Wright cadets for the war effort, one of those colleges was our own Iowa State. You can see the headline from the Iowa State Daily, that bold type, train women here. College will train co-eds for work in airplane engineering. Now, again, remember, Iowa State had been coeducational since it was established. You'd had women here for decades, but the assumption had been that women would major in teaching, in liberal arts, in home economics. They'd had 1 or 2 women in engineering before, but to have 100 women all at the same time come study aeronautical engineering during World War II, that was a revelation. To many people, it seems strange because, again, engineering had been such a masculine domain. But the Curtiss-Wright cadets could use patriotic justification as an excuse for why they were doing something as unusual as going into aeronautical engineering. You can see the drawing here on the left, this young woman, the Curtiss-Wright cadet, walking arm in arm with Uncle Sam, carrying the blueprints and the equipment. And here on the right from the Iowa State Archives, a drawing that one of the cadets herself did, where she's pretty much literally wrapping herself in the American flag, posing again with the books and the blueprints and the drafting equipment. To make a long story short, though, when World War II ended, there was a bit of a conservative backlash and an assumption that, by and large, men and women would return to traditional gender roles. So you see that backlash in engineering, among other places. Engineering colleges got flooded with men on the GI Bill, and some of them literally were unwilling to make room for more women in engineering. But more than that, a number of them argued that despite the record that women had with training and working in engineering during World War II, the assumption was that that was a strange anomaly, that by definition, the assumption was still that engineering remained a masculine domain. You can see here the headline of a 1955 article by Eric Walker, who was the dean of Penn State, where he said flatly, women are not for engineering. He said, aside from a few unusual examples, women would simply get married, and so training them was a waste of time and money. Again, conservative gender roles also trickle down to the K-12 level. This is a couple of images that some of you may have seen in social media in recent years. These are a couple covers of chemistry sets that the Gilbert Scientific Company put out as basically scientific toys for children in the post-World War II years. These 2 chemistry sets were exactly identical on the inside, same chemicals, same equipment, but it's fascinating to compare the 2 covers. I love showing this to audiences and having them pick out all the differences they can find. The one for boys and the one for girls being colored differently, the girls one having a bit more fluffy writing, lab technician versus experiment lab, the boys working with a very complicated setup, the girls doing a much more simpler experiment. Again, these 2 chemistry sets were identical inside, but very much positioning chemistry as something that boys would and should take seriously, and girls, they might perhaps aspired to a career as a lab technician, but nothing more than that. Some women who wanted to pursue advanced degrees in science and engineering after World War II found that these traditional roles, in some cases, explicitly limited where they could go and what they could do. Into the World War II period, several leading technical schools, including Georgia Tech, remained male only. Georgia Tech had never admitted women to its regular undergraduate or graduate programs. More than that, philosophically, Georgia Tech defined technical excellence as being only for men. The Campus Humor magazine for a number of years was full of cartoons making fun of the whole idea of what would happen if you did something as crazy as let women into Georgia Tech. So these cartoons showed women using the hydraulic testing machine to crack pecans, powdering their nose while the chemistry experiment boiled over, and needing to write formulas on their leg under a mini skirt to cheat to get through exams. So this bias really was built into the structure of Georgia Tech. Undergraduates, alumni, and a number of Georgia Tech's leaders assumed that Georgia Tech was and must be for men. But in the post-World War II period, because Georgia Tech was a public school, they ran into a legal case. A young woman who graduated from high school in Atlanta and wanted to come to Georgia Tech. There was no other place in her home state where she could major in engineering. And so that became a big legal question. And in the end, in 1952, Georgia Tech caved in and admitted women to its undergraduate programs on some limited circumstances. You can see here the cartoon the Atlanta Constitution ran, showing lingerie drying from the Campanile, and the headline, what, rah, rah, whoa, whoa, co-ed plan takes tech aback. So Georgia Tech finally admitted women undergraduates in 1952, but among other schools, Caltech still remained male only at the undergraduate level. It was private, so it didn't face the same legal question, and Caltech didn't actually admit women undergraduates until 1969. Part of the problem is that the post-World War II period, as you remember, you have the history of Sputnik, the United States space race against the Soviet Union, the arms race. The federal government was putting a lot of money into science education, and that really prioritized science education and associated it with ideas about the genius and the geek. And both of those were coded as male. This cartoon here, you may not be able to read the fine print, but it shows this little girl looking up at the boy building a computer and asking him, have you always been a genius? So that was very much the gendered assumptions in this post-war period. It's so bad that actually, a few years ago, I was cleaning out my parents' old house, and I happened to find a dictionary from 1959. Since I was thinking about this research topic, I just opened it to see what they said, and I couldn't actually believe it. The literal definition of engineer in the 1959 Webster's Elementary Dictionary is engineer, a man who operates an engine, a man who is skilled in engineering. So literally defining engineering as masculine. There was a post-war effort to push back against that by a number of the women who had gotten degrees and worked in engineering before, during, and after World War II. Specifically in 1952, they organized to form a group called the Society of Women Engineers, SWE. This group is still around, chapters all over the country, including in Iowa. Their first mission was simply to stand up and say, we exist. Women engineers exist to make themselves visible. So they went to local high schools and they talked to groups of young women there, explaining why I am glad that I studied engineering. They distributed information booklets. They wrote personal letters to young women who wrote them asking for advice about whether they could or should enter engineering. This then tied in with late 1960s feminist movement activism. And it's really fun to see a couple local chapters of SWE began putting out their own material to encourage young women to think about going into engineering. Boston's chapter of SWE put out this coloring book called Terry's Trip about this young girl who went to visit her aunt who worked at a toy factory. You can see one of the drawings here on the right. And the book concluded with her saying, maybe someday I'll be an engineer like Aunt Jennifer. North Carolina SWE put out a book called Betsy and Robbie, the story about a young girl who went to a university engineering fair and became fascinated with this little robot built by women engineering students. Again, the whole thing is today, this doesn't sound unusual to us. This doesn't sound radical, but in the late 1960s, this was really completely unprecedented. The big picture of change connects with the feminist movement and broader changes, particularly passage of Title IX in 1972, opening up the law on women, education, and bias. The big picture here is how things did change. If you look at the period from 1960 to 2012, the number of women getting undergraduate degrees, master's degrees, and PhDs in STEM rose almost every year. There are a lot of differences within that. We'll talk about some of those. Women historically and still today were more represented in fields such as biology than in chemistry, than in physics and mathematics. So there are differences within STEM. But the big pattern, by 2012, women earned more than half of all undergraduate degrees in STEM in this country. The ramifications from that really are crucial. With more women getting degrees in STEM, you had more mothers with STEM experience who could communicate that to daughters and sons. You had more fathers who'd majored in science and engineering and were used to seeing female classmates and working with them. Then, as more of those women with STEM degrees joined university faculties, they provided a critical mass on campus to do things like start chapters of their Society of Women Engineering group and lead outreach, where they would get to faculty and female science and engineering students together and go out and give talks and presentations at nearby junior high and high schools. Again, not radical today, but really quite new in the late 60s and early 70s. A lot of what changed over the subsequent decades came from the bottom up in just this way. Women at universities, women in communities who were interested in science and engineering themselves, making efforts to reach out to local young women to get them excited about STEM. One good example of this is in 1974 in California at Berkeley's Lawrence Hall of Science. Some staffers noticed that their after-school math programs attracted a lot of boys, but not so many girls. So they started a targeted program to encourage young women to explore math. That fed into the growth of a group called the Bay Area Teachers in the Math and Science Network. And in 1976, they began holding an annual conference, Expanding Your Horizons, Women in Science and Math. That kept going every year. By 2015, over 1 million young women had gone through Expanding Your Horizons programs. One of those was the first Latina astronaut, Ellen Ochoa. Other examples of local efforts that then linked up with national efforts to draw more young women into STEM. In 1985, the group Girls Incorporated started what they called Operation Science, Math, and Relevant Technology, Operation SMART. 15 years, 500,000 girls. The YWCA started a program called TECHNOLOchicas, and in particular, the Girl Scouts put a new emphasis on STEM. Now, I spent a number of years as a Girl Scout, and I don't remember a lot of emphasis on science and engineering when I was doing it. But now, if you look at the Girl Scout handbook, it offers all sorts of special STEM merit badges in computing and other technology, hands-on workshops and day camps to help young women earn those badges. It's a very deliberate effort in the Girl Scouts to emphasize STEM as part of what they want Girl Scouts to be comfortable with. These local and girl-focused efforts really resonated with the broader community in science and engineering. In particular, in the late 1990s, engineering enrollment for young women stalled. For some years, through the 70s and 80s, the number of young women coming to college and choosing to major in engineering had been growing slowly or relatively steadily, but then it stalled, it plateaued. So the National Academy of Engineering wanted to investigate why this happened, why the number of women choosing to major in engineering remained stuck at less than 20% of total enrollment. They did some research that concluded that engineering still had a number of what they called gender-related image problems. In particular, then president of the National Academy of Engineering, William Wolfe, worried that engineering still had what he called a pocket protector caricature that was repulsive to girls. So the NAE did a bunch of research to figure out what would it take to get more young women excited about engineering, to draw them into it. And their research concluded that young women wanted jobs that paid well, but they also wanted what the researchers called altruistic careers, something where you felt you could make a difference. And so the NAE in the late 90s and early 21st century started a whole outreach program. They put together websites and campaign materials deliberately designed to get girls excited about going into engineering as a way, you can see here, to make the world a better, cleaner, and safer place. So they put together these websites to draw junior high and high school girls into thinking about engineering. They said, women engineers make a difference every day. They're involved in their communities, raising families, enjoying sports and hobbies. So really promoting engineering to young women. The place where there was real agony over the problems of drawing young women, though, was computer science. I mentioned the growth of women with STEM degrees. The big exception there was in computer science, because the number of young women getting bachelor's degrees in computer science actually fell sharply from a peak of 37% of all computer science degrees in 1985. By 2012, women were earning only 18% of computer science undergraduate degrees. That's a complicated story that we can talk about a bit more later, but people looked at that and they said, what's gone wrong here? We've been trying to get more women into STEM. Why is it going in the opposite direction with computer science? So there were a number of initiatives that started trying to draw more young women into interest in computer science. You can see some of the groups here: Girls Teaching Girls to Code, TECHNOLOchicas, Black Girls Code. The heavy hitter was formed in 2012. I'm sure some of you have heard of it, Girls Who Code. This group set up workshops at places like public libraries designed to get young women comfortable with hands-on computer work. In just their first 4 years, they reached over 10,000 young women, and the number has continued to explode ever since. One thing that really fascinates me, though, is the way what I'm calling the girls' STEM movement, these efforts to get more young women excited about the possibility of going into science and engineering, the way that's become really mainstream culture today. There are a whole number of television programs that give a prominent position to encouraging girls to think about science. The Magic School Bus was one of the early ones, but now PBS has a show called SclGirls and Physics Girls. There's Doc McStuffins. There's this one, Project MC Squared, and a number of Hollywood celebrities have really taken up the cause of girls STEM. Emma Watson, Natalie Portman, Eva Longoria, and a number of others have spoken very deliberately about how important it is, they think, for young women to take academics seriously, and especially science and engineering. One place that's especially relevant for libraries to think about this is really the way the past few decades have brought really the creation of an entire new genre of children's books, what I call girls' STEM books. Now, I know the Ames Library has a lot of these, and it seems like every time I go on Amazon, there's a dozen more. Some of the most well-known are Rosie Revere, engineer, and Ada Twist, scientist. There are children's biographies of Marie Curie and Jane Goodall and all sorts of other women in science and engineering. So this new genre really didn't exist just a couple decades ago, and now it's all over the library, all through Amazon. Another new genre that's been created is the rise of what some people call engineering toys for girls. And again, this is a complete historical novelty. If you look at the early 20th century, one of the hot toys then was the erector set, construction kits, but those were explicitly marketed with the tagline, "Hello, boys." Erector sets were marketed to boys themselves as fun and marketed to parents as something you gave your son to encourage them to grow up to become a mechanical engineer. There was really no thought of selling erector sets for girls to play with. Well, in 2012, a Stanford engineering graduate named Debbie Sterling raised $150,000 in 5 days on Kickstarter to promote her new toy, GoldieBlox. You can see the tagline on the image at the bottom right, a toy company out to inspire the next generation of female engineers. In her pitch, Debbie Sterling said, "The scary truth is that only 11% of engineers are women, and girls start losing interest in science as young as age 8. This is our chance to change that, to inspire a generation of girls who are more confident and tech savvy. GoldieBlox is more than a toy, it's a movement." So GoldieBlox, some of you may have seen it if you have kids or if you've bought presents for kids. It's a whole set now of kits that tell stories about this girl Goldie and how she incorporates building and innovation into her everyday life, working with her friends and family and community. And that was very important to Debbie Sterling. She said, boys go in and you give them a pile of parts and they'll just start building. But she said, girls, they approach it differently. She said, girls aren't just interested in what they're building, they want to know why. Goldie's stories relate to helping people. Girls want to make the world a better place. So very much the same idea that the NAE had been thinking about, the assumption from research that it took a different pitch to get girls interested in engineering. There was a bit of a backlash against this, in part because GoldieBlox was positioned very pinkified, as they called it, with pastels and soft colors, but a lot of young women and parents loved it. One review on Amazon for one of the GoldieBlox kits was from a young woman engineer who gave it to her younger sister and said, "I was so excited to see her modify the dunk tank kit to drop dirty silverware into soapy water." Another good example of this new genre of engineering toys for girls that got started in the early 21st century is Ruminate, a DIY wired dollhouse kit, basically a dollhouse where young women were supposed to do the wiring to create working doorbells and lights and even a little TV set in the dollhouse. And the inventors of Ruminate explicitly called it toys to empower girls through hands-on play, because a lot of the conclusion was that boys were still encouraged to tinker, but girls didn't always get that same encouragement to just go in and experiment and get messy. So Ruminate was designed to do that. GoldieBlox was designed to do that. And the Ruminate inventors raised over $1 million on the show Shark Tank to get their business launched. Now, a bit of a controversial but high-profile example was the creation of computer Engineer Barbie in 2010. Some of you may remember this. And it basically came about because some advocates wrote to Mattel and started a grassroots campaign to get Mattel to produce an Engineer Barbie. Please help Barbie get her geek on. The president of SWE, the Society of Women Engineers, Nora Lin, she endorsed having an Engineer Barbie. She said, Barbie will broaden the realm of what feels accessible to girls, being smart, confident, tech savvy, without sacrificing femininity and fun. So Computer Engineer Barbie came out, and a number of women loved it. They put it on their desks as sort of a little role model toy. There was a bit of a backlash, though, from critics. Barbie, you can't rework a caricature of womanhood with impossibly long legs, pert breasts, and glossy hair into some equal opportunity role model by giving her a laptop closed with circuit board motifs and bright pink glasses. Well, despite the critics, Mattel has continued to produce a number of dolls ever since for girls in STEM. I've actually got the two pictured here right on my own desk at this moment. But then Mattel made a crucial mistake. While they had seemed to support the girls' STEM movement by putting out Computer Engineer Barbie, working with SWE and other advocates, Mattel also produced a board book to go with all the new dolls in the series that it issued. So it issued a book, Barbie, Computer Engineer, and this book was an absolute disaster. You can see one of the images from the book here, where it has Barbie working with the computer, but saying she was working on a computer game, but saying, I'm only creating the ideas. I'll need Stephen and Brian's help for the programming to turn it into a real game. This book was a disaster, and the story for this book, it showed Barbie getting her computer infected with a virus, then she infected Skippers with the virus and trying to clean it up, and in the end, Stephen and Brian had to come in to solve the problem. This book got savaged on Amazon. One of the comments, it used to take years of negative messaging to teach women and girls they're second-class citizens in technology. This little gem could give you a great head start at a tender age. Fortunately, social media gave people a way to fight back. Some graduate students in engineering at Georgia Tech took the illustrations and gave them new captions, a remixed version that they posted on the hashtag Feminist Hacker Barbie. So they repositioned Barbie in this children's book saying, I learned a lot more about Python and I'm going to teach myself Java. I hope classes like yours encourage more girls to go into STEM. One of the biggest trends in recent years has been these toys and books, the whole commercialization of the girls' STEM movement. So again, if you go on Amazon today, Lego produces toys and minifigures in the shape of women astronauts and women rocket engineers. Some of this is pink washing. You can see in the center, marketing, chemistry to girls under the heading of a perfume lab or sparkle science. But then there are other t-shirts and items that take a more feminist tone. I like the t-shirt at the bottom that I've seen a number of young girls wearing. Forget princess, I want to be an astrophysicist. One of the big trends in recent years that's gone along with this has been the national visibility for girls' STEM outreach at the national political level and also as a corporate priority. As I already mentioned, more diversity in STEM was in many ways a signature issue for President Obama. After all, he was the father of 2 young women and a bit of a science geek himself. So again, he used the White House Science Fair as a prominent platform. In 2016, he spoke about the need for working through some of the structural biases that exist in science. We've got to get more of our young women and minorities into science and technology. We're not going to succeed if we've got half the team on the bench. First Lady Michelle Obama was also very much involved with this to get more young women into STEM, working through the White House Council on Women and Girls. The Obama White House teamed up with Silicon Valley and about 100 other corporate partners on a 2010 initiative that they called Change the Equation. The idea of getting more appreciation and excitement for STEM among women and underrepresented minorities. They positioned this as a matter of not just justice, but national competitiveness to help Silicon Valley succeed over upcoming decades. In many ways, Silicon Valley and other corporations have thrown their big clout and their big pocketbooks behind the girls' STEM movement. In recent years, if you look online during Women's History Month, International Women's Day, it's inevitable that you'll find messages from Microsoft, Amazon, PayPal, and other big Silicon Valley players showing their support for women and science. They put out videos, they put out a Google Doodle, so showing their enthusiasm for women in STEM. There are a couple of problems with this. First of all, to the extent that Silicon Valley and other corporations have gotten involved with promoting STEM for girls as part of their corporate effort, a lot of it turns out to be branding. So for instance, Apple runs a number of workshops to get girls into computing, but those are literally held inside the Apple stores. They're permeated with Apple branding. Similarly, Disney has issued programming tutorials where they just happen to illustrate all of it with Disney characters. This falls under the heading of what Nancy Fraser has called corporate feminism and raises some questions there. Another problem is that a lot of the message that's come out of Silicon Valley is the reason they want to get more young women into STEM is the hope that at some future time down the road, they say, this will get more women with degrees in engineering and we'll be able to hire more women right here in Silicon Valley. The problem is when you look at the research, a lot of the evidence suggests that these days, it's not so much a problem with women getting hired in Silicon Valley. A number of corporations have actually become relatively good about recruiting and hiring women. The problem is the climate in a lot of Silicon Valley companies means that, as you see here, about half or more than half of them often quit after 5 or 10 years, driven out by hostile work environments. And I'm sure you've seen the headlines over recent years, workplace harassment and discrimination at Tesla, Twitter, Uber, Google, and a whole bunch of other Silicon Valley firms. So in some ways, I worry that the effort that Silicon Valley and other corporations are putting into girls' STEM is distracting attention, or worse, even covering up the problems that they have right there today in 2022 for the women who are already working in these companies. More than that, there is the issue of whether the focus on girls' STEM in recent years has served to, in some ways, perhaps distract attention from broader structural questions, national economic instability, wage stagnation, job insecurity, and in particular, differences who goes into STEM, not just between young men and young women, but differences geographically and socioeconomically. A lot of schools in poorer communities have been described as STEM deserts, where they don't have the teachers, they don't have the equipment, they don't have the resources. So in 2017, 90% of high schools in relatively well-off districts taught physics, only 43% of schools in poorer districts. 62% of the more well-resourced high schools offered computer science, only 26% among less advantaged schools. So that's an issue to pay attention to. But the big picture here is, I'm a historian. I like focusing on the big picture. Over 6 decades, there has been a radical transformation. It was once seen as radical or even impossible to talk or think about bringing more women into science and especially engineering in large numbers. Today, that's not the case. The movement has succeeded in mainstreaming the idea that it's important to think about encouraging more young women to go into STEM. And that's a revolutionary shift in the nature of American science and engineering itself. So that's the big picture. I'll be happy to talk more about any of the aspects that you want or anything else that's caught your attention. Thank you very much for letting me talk about a subject that I love. So let me see if I can stop sharing screen here. And we'll see if there are any questions. Yes. Question from Simon. How can universities and colleges best help recruit women into STEM? Are there consortia doing this work, or is it by individual institution? So that's a really great question. You know, every time I give this talk, I always get people asking me, you know, what's the solution? What do we do here? And I wish there was one simple, easy answer. But the thing is, this is such a complicated phenomenon, both historically and present, crossing issues of gender and education and socioeconomic background, that there's no one simple solution. But having said that, a number of universities and colleges are doing and have done amazing work. So here at Iowa State, some of you may know, Iowa State has its own program for women in science and engineering that every year runs day-long, weekend-long workshops to encourage more young women to go into STEM. So they bring them into Iowa State labs. They have Iowa State undergraduates giving them talks. So some universities are doing this on their own. Some undergraduates are doing it. Some faculty are doing it. Some staff are leading efforts. And deans of engineering through groups such as the National Academy of Engineering definitely compare notes to see what works. But unfortunately, this is the type of thing that COVID had an impact on and that budget cuts have an impact on. So it's not easy, and you have to make sure to keep it up because, of course, every year a new set of young women comes along. Okay, question from Mike about the prevalence of women, especially in the biological sciences, right? So I was one of those statistics. My undergraduate degree is biology, and in some ways I did what's called dropping out of the pipeline by choosing to go to graduate school in history of science rather than biology. But as far as women in biology, there are a number of reasons for that. In some ways, it's seen as a bit more in line with traditional assumptions for women as far as caregiving and being close to nature. In particular, a lot of people have been promoting the recent rise of environmental science and engineering as subfields that are particularly likely to draw disproportionately women. And in recent years, the number of women applying to medical school has gone up. Actually, a few years ago, the number of women applying to medical school in the US actually passed the number of men applying. And so, of course, you get the pre-meds there. But it's not just women going into biology. Unfortunately, it's women being turned away from other fields. So my husband is a physicist, and the physics community has long worried about factors that seem to discourage women from majoring in physics. And there are some advocates there who have been doing their part to try to turn that around. There are groups for women in physics, support groups the same way you have the groups for women in engineering. There are some researchers who've done some very interesting research on how physics departments themselves can convert to be more welcoming to women undergraduate majors, but it's still an uphill battle. So, okay, that's kind of a long story. I got carried away there. Okay, Aja, what efforts have been the most advantageous and what actions and inactions have been the most harmful? I think some of the most advantageous, again, really are this dual approach from the top down and the bottom up. So top down, Silicon Valley, whether or not you like what individual corporations do, they have a big microphone, they have multi-million-dollar budgets that they can use to do things like support programs for women in STEM. So organizations and corporations such as Amazon and Microsoft and Google, every year they underwrite conferences for women in STEM, conferences for girls' science education. Money makes a difference. Putting up a Google Doodle for women in STEM, people around the world are going to see that. So the top down does help. The National Science Foundation, they've got money, they've got a big audience. That makes a difference. But then bottom up, people working, for instance, here at Iowa State, looking at what's going to work for young women in Iowa, getting to know them and their parents on a first name basis, keeping up with them over the years. So I think it really is both of them, top down and bottom up. As far as what doesn't work, I think unfortunately there have been missteps. It's not just Mattel's bad book on Barbie computer engineer. There's a whole series of those. There was a campaign, I think it was IBM, where they positioned a particular campaign to get girls into STEM by saying, go hack your hairdryer. So playing into gender stereotypes. And then there was one picture that went viral on social media. It was a science center somewhere in Ohio. I can't remember which one, and I'm not sure it's worth shaming them anyway, but they had a long list of programs for boys in STEM, meteorology, computers, and then at the bottom of that long list of STEM programs for boys, they had one STEM program for girls that was called something like Sparkle Science. So, maybe well-meaning, but a definite misstep. So, okay, did I miss a question in here, Susan, you're saying?
I think you did end up covering it.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So where are we now?
So there's one more.
Right. More young women joining Boy Scouts instead of Girl Scouts. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. That's absolutely fascinating. I think it is a bit too early to say what's going on there. And of course, it's going to have ramifications in a lot more areas than just young women's exposure to STEM. But I think I know that's upset a number of people in the Girl Scouts organization. And the Girl Scouts really deserve credit. The organization has poured a ton of effort in recent years into supporting the Girls STEM campaign. They did a whole set of studies of young women in their teenage years, and they found that really a majority of them were potentially interested in science, but they asked the young women what discouraged them from going into it. And young women said things like explicitly, they expected they would have to work harder than men in order to be taken seriously in STEM. So the Girl Scouts have been paying a lot of attention to this. And ideally, I'd like to see them working together with the Boy Scouts to really take these campaigns in creative new directions that would have a lot of potential, I think. Great question.
Well, thank you, Dr. Amy Bix. That was very, very interesting.